Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Matthew Mehan. I am the Director of Academic Programs here at the Alan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship, where we think a lot about the principles of our Constitution, but also about the nation and its people, and what it means to be a citizen, and what all that entails if done well. And to that end, I have with me today author Timothy P. Carney, who's written Alienated America. And Tim is the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow of the American Enterprise Institute. He's written a number of books, including The Big Ripoff and Obamanomics. And he's here to talk about his book today, but I think a proper introduction might include things like Tim and I built a deck together once. Tim and I have shared a drink now and again, and our kids have been on t-ball and baseball teams together. And so if we're looking for Alienated America, no better place to start than a good conversation between friends. So without further ado, Tim, why don't you, I'm going to do to you what John Miller did to me when he had me up here, which is, why don't you give us a sort of 30-second elevator pitch, but rather than to a publisher, because you're published, how about to a Broadway musical? You've got Lin-Manuel right there, how do you write this as a musical?
Well, you've got three main characters, right? You've got the elites, you've got the religious conservatives, and you have the alienated. And these represent most of America. So the community and civil society has been eroding in America. This is something Robert Putnam wrote about in Bowling Alone. And it's been eroding for everybody, but not equally. And the working class, one of the main ways that they're suffering is that they don't have the institutions that connect them to other people, that provide them with a sense of purpose, a safety net, modeling. And meanwhile, though, there are two other characters in this musical, and one all around here, Washington, D.C., where everybody has college degrees, lots of people have advanced degrees, and guess what? They are living the conservative life, even if they're not voting that way, finishing school, getting a job, getting married, having kids, being involved in their kids' lives and their community lives. But then the third character, we'll call her Holly Van Heemstra, is a Dutch Christian Reform person living in Oostburg, Wisconsin, where I think this musical probably takes place after a bus goes off the road in the snow or something. And in Oostburg, Wisconsin, they have all the same good outcomes as Chevy Chase, Maryland up the road here, but without the money. What they have bringing them together are the churches that create the fundamental core of the strong civil society for the middle class. And so then you realize that with the alienated characters, what happened was secularization and deinstitutionalization led to this alienation, and thus the deaths of despair, the dropping out of college, out of high school, the out of wedlock births, and the dropping out of the labor force.
Sort of a planes, trains, and automobiles musical
Yes.
reboot kind of thing. Yeah, so what is alienation then? What does that mean?
So one definition of alienation I use in there is by Robert Nisbet, who was he was a fellow at AEI, where I do a fellowship, and he said something very interesting. I had to read it twice. Alienation is a state of mind of not being connected to society, but also not seeing the point of being connected to society. And to see both of those, that's really important. But practically, and we should go deeper on that later, but practically, alienation a family can be alienated. You could be married with your kids, and if you're not able to raise your family together with neighbors, with some other institutions, it's a lot harder, and it's a lot less likely to fail. I use the image of the Cyclops from the Odyssey in there, where the Cyclops, if you guys have read the Odyssey, he's this beast. He has only one eye. He lives on this island. He's terrifying. when you read it really closely, Cyclops is kind of a family man, right? Like he's in the cave with his wife or wives, I don't remember, and all his kids, but he doesn't interact with his neighbors. So I would say the main way I see alienation in America today is not belonging to the institutions of civil society. That it's not just you don't have many friends, it's you don't belong to something. It's a lack of belonging, and what goes along with it, as Nisbet points out, is not seeing the point of belonging.
Right, and that inability to see, what are some of the causes of that blindness, essentially, right? If the alienated can't see why they should join, what are some of the causes of that?
I might ask that the other way, or put it the other way, that I think most people don't see a lot of people don't see the value of these connections, and either because J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy used the term, because his story was he lived in one of these alienated suburbs. If you guys remember Hillbilly Elegy, his family moved out of the holler in Kentucky. He lands in Middletown, Ohio, and there's just no connection. His family has fallen apart. His mom can't get her act together to build a new family. And he says when he finally got to law school, just because he was really bright, he realized that connection and knowing people was immensely valuable. He always thought it was just going to be achievement. And just these, and he said, the people around me who had these connections didn't realize what it was because it was the air that they breathed. It's like why a fish doesn't notice the water. And so a lot of us don't see the value of connection, even if we're connected. I mean, right now, I often say our circles are often the overlap of these two, the religious conservative and the elite. And it can be easy to take it for granted. The institutions that give you the sense of purpose and the safety net are also the ones who are always like asking you to do more, and it can almost seem annoying. And so you don't necessarily see it when you're in it, and you don't necessarily see it when you're out of it. So I'd take a step back from your question and say, why is it so hard for us to understand and even notice civil society? And even the political debate is often individualism versus more government. And a lot of conservatives and libertarians argue that individualism is the answer to more government. That's what Ayn Rand's whole shtick was. And so again, that's missing the middle bonds.
Is it wrong to say then, am I hearing you saying that we shouldn't pin this on the alienated and the downtrodden, this blindness, but it's actually a national blindness?
Yeah.
And that the elites, one of the three characters in your Hamilton Redux, the elites are actually failing their job of communicating this? Yes,
and even of noticing it and certainly articulating its value. One of the things I argue, I think so I point out that if you have a college degree and a higher education, you are more likely to favor more redistribution of wealth. And so that's sort of an empirical reinforcement of an idea that you're more likely to be a liberal if you're an elite. But they think that, too many people think that what they have going for them, that their most valuable asset is their money, their income, or in some ways the status conferred upon them by their degrees. And I argue, no, it's that they're plugged in and connected. The most valuable asset of the people in Chevy Chase, Maryland, and I pick on Chevy Chase in the beginning of the book because it's the wealthiest municipality in this region, which is the wealthiest region in this country, which is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. The most valuable asset they have is not their $1.5 million house. They're paying $1.5 million for a house so they can live in a place where their kids are riding tricycles up and down the street, where the Little Leagues, and if they want, the Catholic parish, all of these things are these tight, overlapping, tightly knit institutions of civil society that give you better access to the good life. And so the elite failure, sometimes conservatives like to say they don't preach what they practice, right? And I don't put that much stake in most people preaching that much. I think the main thing is they're not willing to realize, especially the ones that are able to implement public policy, that the community institutions, the connection they have, that is the most valuable thing that they have. That's their greatest asset.
Mm-hmm. Now, in the book, you make a kind of several categories, and you talk about One of them being the combination of big government and big business. And I think, if I got you correctly, you say big business, the promise is lower prices, right, because of economies of scale.
Yep.
And big government, the promise is efficiency.
Yep.
Now, that all reduces prices at the cost of community with regard to centralization. But why can't we then say that really America has essentially decided they're not willing to pay the costs for civil society? They don't want to pay it, right? It's sort of it's a free market argument that they've just decided no. We don't want to pay those costs. We like efficiency, which reduces costs in government, and we like lower prices at Walmart.
So to some extent you can. I mean, if we brought my earlier two books up on stage, I could
I was going to ask you how the progression of your two books.
So my first two books were, the subtitle of The Big Ripoff is How Big Business and Big Government Steal Your Money. The first draft of it was Why Big Business Lobbies for and Profits from Bigger Government. So to some extent, economic centralization is not the fruit of free market capitalism, but of government intervention. That's an important point. But I think maybe a more interesting point is that community, nobody chooses, very few people choose community because they say, I want to have more connection and a private little safety net and something to give me a sense of purpose. You belong to something because there's some more visible benefit. And sometimes it's perfectly spiritual. Sometimes it's I'm going to Mass because I'm obligated to. Sometimes it's I'm joining this church because it's the best way for me to volunteer and feed my neighbors and that sort of thing. Sometimes it's I'm going to my local diner because they have coffee and eggs. But all of these choices to step into an institution have all these unanticipated, less visible, but very crucial benefits. And I think that, to go back to your earlier question, a lot of civil society is that we don't, it's very hard for any of us to see the value, and we kind of can accidentally end up tapping into it. So with regard to economics here, I kind of start chapter 2 in 1955 in Pittsburgh, and a blue-collar guy with a high school degree working in a steel factory. And the fact is that life is good for him. He's able to, if he can put in the 30 years, show up on time, do all that work, his wife can stay at home if she wants to, and with some overtime, in 15 years they're buying a little cabin on the lake and a fishing boat. And then they can retire with dignity. And that's not possible anymore because of economic efficiency. So America's wealthier because we have more trade with China, with Europe, and all that stuff. So we didn't choose to be inefficient to provide this. It was sort of almost an accident. Europe was devastated by the war. There wasn't as much navigable seaways. And for that white working class guy, he was protected from competition from black people, people in foreign countries, people who wanted to be here, from women. So all of these things that are not things that anybody would or should deliberately design had created this sort of nice situation for the white working class guy outside of Pittsburgh. And so just because there's an efficiency to be gained and there's progress to be made by changing that situation doesn't mean there's not a real loss. And so I cite the economic studies by David Autor, who was a great MIT economist, who pointed out that the places that were competing with China the most, they didn't just have a downturn in wages. They had an uptick in unemployment, an uptick in men then dropping out of the labor force, a downturn in marriage, an uptick in out-of-wedlock births, and ultimately a spike in deaths of despair, suicide, drug overdoses, alcohol deaths. So good for the whole country, all of the progress, racial, gender, free trade, efficiency, but bad for these places.
Yeah, and that's the question that you raise, I think, that the question of how do you actually deal with the problem of place? And I'm thinking of it in regard to you talk about elite bubbles and elite enclaves in this area and megacities. Have you seen any previews for or heard about Peter Jackson's movie Mortal Engines?
No.
Where essentially as some post-nuclear apocalypse, everyone says, forget it, the cities have to be mobile. so we're going to put them on half tracks and move London around, right? But then they start devouring other cities and sort of just eating them to sustain themselves. What happened to these smaller communities, and why didn't they have the sort of robust civil society safety net that you talk about in the book?
So, I mean, a good comparison, I go to Uniontown, Pennsylvania in Fayette County, south of Pittsburgh. And I also discuss Pittsburgh, where I went in my travels. Both of these places were devastated by the closure of a lot of steel mills and by the coal industry dying. But Pittsburgh's doing really well right now. And the Uniontown is not. I mean, the stories I tell from Smitty's bar are depressing. People talking about seeing drug needles at the kids' school bus stop. So the parents, the mom, while dropping off her kids, presumably is there with her needles. Why is Fayette County doing so poorly while Pittsburgh is doing so well? And the simplistic answer, which is partly true, is, well, in Pittsburgh, a lot of these industrialists invested in things that could be good employers, like the healthcare system and universities. But if we only see them as employers, we're missing half the story. They also invested in art museums, in parks, and then there was this bunch of little neighborhoods. You've got the Italian parish over here. You've got Squirrel Hill with the Tree of Life Synagogue as its center over here. Dense, overlapping networks of civil society institutions, the big ones that were citywide, the little neighborhood ones, and then the public schools stay strong because people are staying in their neighborhood and people are committed, even though times have turned down a little bit. And what's preserved, even if the money is a little bit down, is the human capital. Because the community institutions, what they do is they're preserving strong education, making it easier for people to get married and raise families, and just people are in better shape. Go out to Uniontown, maybe in some of the smaller places in Fayette County, Fayette City, for instance, there's one Protestant church and one Catholic church. Catholic church closes down. The bishop says, oh, your church isn't closed. You've just been consolidated with St. Raphael's 20 miles away. St. Raphael's was probably your arch rival when you were in CYO basketball. You're not going to go there. I mean, I talked to people in the Pittsburgh area who said they stopped going to church when their parish closed down. And so a lot is lost there, even if you're looking at it from a secular perspective. The diner where the factory workers used to go shuts down, and people become alienated, and then they lose their human capital. So if you're an employer 20 years later, you show up, you're not going to set up in Fayette County. You might set up in Pittsburgh. Well, the wages are a little low because there's high unemployment, but the human capital is high. And it's not so high in the places where the civil society was thinner, where I imagine people sort of falling, and the safety net of Pittsburgh can catch them long enough for them to bounce back. This thin piece of paper in Uniontown, they're falling, and they bring with them the parish, the diner, and the Little League.
Do you see that as, you start the description, you start in Pittsburgh, and then you go up into the Alleghenies, right, to these steel towns. Do you see it as the jobs of cities to sort of export through suburb to exurb to out-county, those sorts of habits in some sense?
I don't know.
Are those places reliant on the big cities?
It used to be simply that, so Charles Murray in Coming Apart argues that there was just a more even distribution of skills in a time when we were less mobile. So there's a clear downside to that. You have to take a job in your hometown. And so the kid who's she's the smartest kid in the whole school, clearly could go to Princeton and become a doctor, may end up becoming the principal of the local high school. That's really good for the kids of Newton, Iowa. It's a loss for, the aggregate GDP of the United States.
I just gave a talk at a classical school in St. Louis, and the Latin teacher is a Harvard grad, and it's this tiny little, just started in a shopping mall. You go, oh, well, that's going to go well for you guys. That's helpful.
But that's a lot less common. So that could just be it, that it used to be, if you were looking to set up a factory, there were 10,000 towns in the U.S. where you could be like, I could get some good workers in any of these towns. Now you're looking to go anywhere. And think about when Amazon was doing their job search. What were they looking at? places with high concentrations of skilled workers. And a bunch of handouts. But if we ignore that part, the high concentration of skilled workers is a really good thing. But there was something about the skilled workers, the PTA moms, the T-ball coaches being more equally distributed in the past that had a good result. Now, the problem is we're in Washington, and you think, you talk about a problem, you always want a solution. You can't force people to stay in their hometowns. You can't forcibly, I know people who would think about this, redistribute high IQ, hardworking extroverts around the country. So we're describing a problem that is the fruit of a sense of progress and an efficiency.
But so we have some friends in this town, probably more than in other towns, but who are somewhat more socialist in their leanings, and they would say, Tim, look, the steel mill got things going in the river valleys and in the Alleghenies, and they're the sole sort of economic problem. You just flood of jobs and cash, right, and habits of just doing it, and then they shut down and the thing dies. It's absolutely about the economy, stupid. That's the big thing. If you can get jobs to these people, if you can get money so they can have a household and a home, right? That's it. That's the whole ball of wax, because it appeared because of those mills, those places, and then they died because of those mills.
That explanation is almost always skipping a few steps, is what I would argue. So the three answers I have. One is the Pittsburgh and Fayette County one. Pittsburgh and Fayette County both suffered from the loss of jobs, but Pittsburgh civil society held it up. Second explanation is Williston, North Dakota. The church on the front of the book there is right outside of Williston, North Dakota. Williston is this fracking town. So they found the Permian shale underneath there, and they out of nowhere, just a ton of jobs appeared. So people would travel all over, and you could land there with a high school degree. Once you pass your drug test, you get an $18 an hour job. And so this one social economist, Melissa Carney, no relation, she spells it different, she's at Brookings Institution, she said, the middle class, the working class, where the wages have dropped, are the ones that have retreated from marriage. Again, the elites are practicing what the conservatives are preaching. The working class is getting married at a far, far lower rate. So what happens when the working class get good, high-paying jobs? And she didn't just look at Williston. She looked at places that weren't as remote, mostly the places that weren't as remote, Pennsylvania, Texas. What happens in a place, lots of working class people, where the guys all of a sudden get good-paying jobs? Because it's male wages that predict marriage, not female wages. The women in those towns were not getting married at any higher rate after the good-paying jobs came in. They were having babies at a slightly higher rate, but not getting married at any higher rate. And so what I argue is this is because what made the working class retreat from marriage was not simply a drop in wages. It was the concomitant retreat of civil society and erosion of those institutions. The churches, not just the churches being out there preaching you ought to get married, but providing, again, our kids play on the same baseball teams. The neighboring parish is where they're playing now. There's just these 6 awesome baseball coaches. I was watching them the other day. They're running the practice really well. I coached Thomas in T-ball or coach pitch baseball or whatever. It's easier to raise kids when there's lots of people like that around you, and then institutions like a parish or a little league or a bowling league or whatever, through which these people can provide these services to your kids, to your wife, to your family. And so those institutions aren't there in the blue-collar places that have been suffering for a generation. They can slowly come back, but if the money lands there. But the money's probably not going to land there unless either A, they're sitting on top of a bunch of oil, or B, there are strong communities there to preserve the human capital, and it's a desirable sort of base of employment.
I noticed you spent some time talking about Utah and Mormon communities, and in one sense, it's when you think of Salt Lake City and the mountains of the salt flats of Utah, you don't think of, wow, the promised land of, it's all about the ripe and fertile valleys of Utah, and there are plenty, but that's a religious community that started from nothing but religious fervor to go live as they wish.
Yep. And so I went out there, and that's where I had the head of the conservative think tank say, Hillary was right, it takes a village. So talking about raising children, you need strong support and community and family. On the state flag of Utah is a beehive. Now, when Hillary says it takes a village, or if Bernie Sanders started talking about a beehive, you would start worrying about like collectivism, socialism, that sort of thing. Beehive, I mean, the worker bees are just slaves to the queen, and the drones are actually like sex slaves to the queen, and the queen is in charge of everything. But
in your defense and their defense, Virgil talks about the beehive as an image for the human community.
Yes, and so that's the thing is but when you look at it and like imagine in its early days, especially religious settlers, yes, they're all going to work for the common good. And if you've ever been on something, I sometimes use the analogy of the men's baseball team I used to play on, and nobody was setting like incentives or punishments for playing hard or showing up on time or anything. You were just part of something, and you cared about the outcome, and so you did it. And that's what, a parish is like. A lot of strong community institutions are like that. And so that when I was out there in Utah, that's what I found. It's this like real conservatism that even extends over to like really constantly preaching. Self-reliance is a term that's very commonly used in the LDS church. Self-reliance is a virtue at the same time that your duty to care for your neighbor is huge. So one of the stories I ran into there, and I thought about this compared to the government welfare state, was a guy who now runs it's kind of a food kitchen. It's a grocery store called the Bishop's Storehouse, where you go and you can pick up your food for free if you need it. And your local kind of a pastor, sort of advisor in your local parish, your ward, fills out a form of what you need. So this guy had lost a job, and Don, whose job it was in his parish, shows up at his house. You've lost your job. What do you have literally stored up in your pantry? And so they go through that. What do you have in your savings account? What's your rent, your insurance, etc.? And they go through it. He's like, okay, so for the first 2 weeks, you've got savings and you've got food in your pantry. 2 weeks after that, you're going to need a little bit of help. But also, you have this fishing boat. And the guy was like, Don, yeah, it's not like an extravagance. I go fishing with my kids. And he goes, yes, but remember, if you go and start drawing food out of the Bishop's Storehouse, how is that paid for? That's paid for by voluntary donations of the other people in Salt Lake City. And where does that money come from? Their practice is, we're going to give up a meal, once a week? Mm-hmm. And the price of that meal is we're going to donate to fund the Bishop's Storehouse. So are you asking your neighbors to give up a meal for them and their kids so that you can keep your fishing boat? Because if you sell that fishing boat, then it's 6 weeks out that you can keep paying for it. And by then, you'll probably have a job. And so when you tell this story, it's very interesting. Some people, oh, that's absurdly intrusive. As opposed to the government asking you to pee in a cup and take this drug test and all the other things where you're either going to slip through the cracks or there's all these cases of fraud. This, to me, was charity done with love and accountability on a local level, thinking motivated by a higher cause. And I thought, so much public policy is an attempt to replicate that without the love and without the accountability.
Yeah, without the love. You talk a lot about the difference between transactional versus relational. Could you expand on that? What's wrong with transactions? I mean, you're a free market guy, right? I mean,
I love transactions. We need transactions. We have transactions every day. I only got a ride here because of transaction with, a cabbie. But relational is where this is where you're putting in what you can and taking out what you need, which of course is what Marx talks about, right? From each according to his means to each according to his needs. But communism with love, I guess is what I mean by relational. That the worst relationship advice I ever got was somebody saying, you ought to look at your marriage as sort of having a ledger. And so you do a favor for your wife and then she'll do one for you. It was really bad advice, and I never considered following it for a moment.
But what about an alienated America?
Yes. What do you do in a marriage? You pour in what you have and you hope to take out. So neighbors, true neighborliness is doing what your neighbors need, but also not totally selflessly. That's part of what I mean by relationally, with sort of a knowledge that you're going to get what you need. So helping people move. We've talked about our friendship. We have repeatedly helped one another move.
It is like a blood oath at this point. Like, I will be there.
I asked 18 people to help me move, and 16 of them showed up. One of them was in Iraq, and the other one had kidney stone.
Yeah, cancer.
And so that wasn't me counting up everybody I had helped move, but I like helping people move. And these guys all do it, even though it's an expenditure of social capital. So that's the thing, relational versus transactional. I think that's a big problem. We are increasing the transactional culture. And I mean, really, somebody could write a book, just transactional culture, that you expect to get something for everything you put in. We need a transactional economy for a huge part of the economy, but some part of our life has to be more relational.
Mm-hmm. Now, with regard to sort of building up this sort of social capital is one way of talking about. Community is the sort of Nisbet phrase. And I actually this is sort of more of a public announcement. I think a lot about this in sort of old school Republican terms of community being the type of relational transactions, if you want to put it, get it all in there. The type of relationships that deal with the human body. Like, you need money, you need food, you need clothing, you need schools, dealing with family and bodies. And society is sort of a little more free-ranging because it's more about your mind. Like, you can have a Hegelian society and some guy you've never met, but you write letters about Hegel or something in Germany, Augsburg, Germany, as opposed to Wisconsin. And the community is more tactile and physical. What do you make of the sort of understanding of the community as, or I shouldn't say what do you make of it? Why do you put the church, right, and church going as just sort of the queen in the middle of the chessboard, sort of like, here's the big power move, and you put it out there, and it's kind of startling in the book where you sort of like, okay, boom.
The middle chapter. Is called It's About Church.
I noticed it was right in the middle. Very nice. Yeah.
I went to St. John's.
Yeah, that's right.
So
all classical writers put their most important teaching in the smack dab middle of the book.
Yeah. So my secret teaching is It's About Church. And so so first of all, the key word I use in the two words I use in the It's About Church chapter are attendance is the first one. The sociological data shows very religious people have far better outcomes, and whether it's their children, not going to jail, their children finishing school, their marriages staying together, them not having drugs, not falling out of the labor force. But the key thing, if you look at measures of self-express, like seriousness of belief or frequency of prayer, those don't really have any upward effect on the numbers. Attendance is what produces a good outcome. So that's sort of the sociological explanation. Belonging is the more sort of human level thing. If you go to a church regularly, you belong to something. And belonging means people need you, people know you, people will take care of you. The preface of the book is when our daughter was in the hospital, and one part of it is all the food we got. I mean, it was like an overwhelming amount of food people brought us because we couldn't make dinner. When my son read this, he goes, "Dad, you should have included the fact that we were envied by the other kids at school because our lunches were better than theirs.
I heard about it.
Yeah.
My sons go to school too. I heard about it.
This one family brought us sandwiches from the corner bakery and just like a giant tray of them. And so we had to like give them to lunch. It was dinner. It was everything. But then one of my other favorite moments was my wife was at the late morning mass when she finally looked at her phone, and I said, I'm sprinting to the ER. And she just turned to her daughter and said, you stay here. Go sit with Dory. She'll give you a ride home, and otherwise somebody else will. And that moment, and when I wrote about that, and I got this flood of response of people saying, thank you, that's what I get from my church community. It's this belonging. But the other reason it's at the center of the book and on the cover of the book is that we talk about institutions of civil society, and for the middle class and the working class in America, the church has always been the core institution of civil society. And a secularization of this country has been manageable for the elites, who, first of all, actually go to church. If you take the top 20%, go to church more than the bottom 20%, but have other institutions to fall back on, whether it's their alumni networks, professional networks, their communities where the one of the parents is more likely to have flexible work hours. If you have a blue-collar job, there's a good job that you don't have flexibility, or your boss tells you, here's your schedule for the next 2 weeks. That person can't coach T-ball, can't be in the PTA, because they don't know when they're going to be on call.
Right. But what do you say to the sort of, you have a whole section on secularization and this sort of antipathy to church that you get in sort of coastal elite circles, but not, it's kind of a broader cultural elite opinion. What do you get, how do you respond to this notion of, yes, true, we all came over here as sort of religious exiles to set up colonies, Maryland and Boston and Salt Lake, these religious minorities for freedom of religion. But, that's the past. We have the future. Why can't we progress to something else? And why can't the source of belonging, that unifying force, be a really wonderful community center that is not religious, that is secular, based on science and reason alone? We can do this. We can beat God, right? but how do you argue against that if if the grounds are a sense of belonging or non-alienation?
First of all, there's very little evidence of that existing. There's elite circles and there's strong religious communities, and that's where you get good outcomes. There can be other things that are very local. So in New England and New York, you get strong public schools that are actually controlled by the local people. That's the closest thing to something of a replacement, but it's rare. And it's kind of fairly intermixed with the religious and the elite circles. But I would say that that virtue is, I think, what's going to be missing from a secular attempt to replicate this. That instead it gets replaced with sort of best practices. And this is ironic for me to say in some ways because there's tons of sociological stuff in there, but I begin and I end with real human stories. I begin with my daughter going to the hospital, and I end with sort of building a city in speech, a parish in speech, and bringing neighbors and the poor and all that stuff together. I begin and end with human stories because I think ultimately this is a community story, but individual virtue, I should say virtue, is going to be at the core of it. And the elites right now, the best secular communities we're having, I don't think are inculcating virtue. They describe it as a best practice. They know that if you wait to have sex, your life is more likely to end better off. They know you should finish school and then get a job and then get married because that's what the social science data show you. But I don't think that there's indications, and I have some numbers in near the end of chapter 11 there, that doesn't succeed in passing on a dedication to community. I call it infertile virtue. And that to have a shared higher purpose that you're engaged in is absolutely necessary to communities. And I think that the only thing that makes that shared higher purpose hold up is it actually being a higher cause.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought, frankly, you've got another argument that I thought maybe you would offer, and I want to offer because I think it's for secular people who don't believe it's a powerful one. I thought you demonstrated quite well the notion of you can't do it because there's not enough money in the world to actually fund that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That the sort of spiritual resource of a church community that is always going to be there for people without tons of means and lots of other.
And this is Oostburg, Wisconsin, or Orange City, that they are replicable. The raw material of this is God, people who want to serve their community. The raw material of Chevy Chase is oodles and oodles of cash. Right. And a lot of liberal public policy is look at the great outcomes in these elite places. Let's spend enough money to make everybody elites. That doesn't work. I don't necessarily want to make everybody Mormons or Oostburgers, but something closer to that is more replicable than making everybody Chevy Chase.
And if building community does have all these sorts of, it reinforces the sequence of success and winds up starting to build up all these other economic fruits and more material fruits that people sort of point to as, see, this is great. It seems to me there is a kind of a binary choice there. It's like you either are headed in that direction of rebooting community through church, right? Read the book. It's much more complicated than that in one sense, but it does boil down in one sense. Or you really do say, I don't know another solution other than appropriating all monies and distributing it in a sort of, it's like everyone, gets one for you, one for you, one for you. But you seem to argue too that even won't work. With regard to, you have a whole section on Aristotle. I'm a political philosophy guy myself, so I was like, yes, the political animal. Why can't that work, period?
Why can't
the even if you did redistribute all the income?
Yeah, well, so, I mean...
let's just assume it has been done. It was tried in 1917, wasn't a great look, but...
well, first of all, people need to be agents of... people need to exercise their political muscles. You're not supposed to just live your own life, but also to shape the world around you. And I know we have at least a couple libertarians in this room, and so I don't mean to say you should be managing other people's lives, but shaping the world around you is what it means that we're supposed to be political animals. And my main way I shape the world around me is not through my columns or TV appearances or anything like that. I don't think I've changed a dime of federal spending, but it's to...
Ex-Im Bank.
Except for the Export-Import Bank.
Export-Import Bank, come on.
So,
go, Tim, go.
But mostly it's, again, there's a baseball program, as small as it is, in our parish because of efforts that I and this other guy have done. And there's the intersection near our house actually is a little bit changed. The lights and the lines, because my wife and I lobbied our local government. On that local personal level is how you get to exercise your political muscles. If you take that power away from people, put in the central government as Bernie Sanders would, you then liberate everybody from the duty to serve their neighbors, right? Because the central state is providing. And this is, Tocqueville spends pages and pages on this. Mm-hmm. And then once that's happening, then we're not actually living out our lives as political animals. And this is where Tocqueville said it would be wrong to call this paternalistic, because no father worth the name would raise his kids in such a way that they never had a duty to care for other people. It's worse than paternalistic. It's keeping people perpetually as children. So if you strip from people the responsibility to serve their neighbors through some massive redistribution, then you're stripping their ability to live their lives. And I tell stories in there from Oostburg, from Salt Lake City, and also Chevy Chase or Fairfax County or other elite places of people finding their meaning in life through relations and through serving other people. And you can't take that away from people and still expect good outcomes.
Yeah, the last question that I'm going to ask, then we'll open it up to everyone else, is take us through a few of the more practical solutions. Mm-hmm. And I'll try to throw a barb here. I found myself reading the solutions and going, yes, good, yes. But then I paused and said, well, wait a minute. What about structural questions?
Yeah.
Constitutional questions. I mean, here we're at the Kirby Center.
Yeah.
And I'm not springing this on you. I told you I was going to do this, but what about the repeal of the 17th Amendment? Getting place reestablished, right? I know it's got a bad name, states' rights. People recoil from that. But you seem to talk a lot about how places, not necessarily large population centers, need...
Places having identity and people being attached to it. And again, go to Park Slope in Brooklyn, and the wealthy elite hipsters are proud to be from Park Slope. So they will use like blood and soil as a curse word in their column in the New York Times, and then go home and be super proud of their particular block in Park Slope. Tribalism is a natural part of human life, and it's going to be rooted in place, even in this technological age.
But you don't have to pick up on the 17th Amendment exactly. Yeah. You can if you want. But what sort of things are there? Yeah. Well, I'll just give the one I know. You start with go to church, right?
Go to
Get
church.
engaged. But what
structure? So if you want to, so there's little tiddly. This tax code should stop favoring really big, expensive houses, because that's what the mortgage interest deduction does. It doesn't make more people homeowners. It makes people buy bigger houses, and that's like a example of sort of a one-off. But you're pointing towards politics that reestablishes the importance of place. And so when we were talking about this earlier, it was sort of about like your representation. Think about, my congressional district, I think, is different from your congressional district, and you live 5-minute drive from me, and both of them stretch from the DC border up to Pennsylvania border. So in his congressional district, it has the Bethesda Country Club, and it has Allegheny County, which is like the West Virginia part of Maryland. There is no community of interest. That used to be a term that courts would use for a valid way to draw congressional lines, was community of interest. As far as I know, that's disappeared. Compactness is a good virtue, right? People should live physically close to each other. But community of interest is sort of a sister thing, that what if you had a congressional district that was the people who were the farmers, and then or state legislative district, here's the farmers. Oh, but then here's the dairy farmers. Here's the people who live in town and all can walk to the same public school and parish. Then their representative would be a representative. It would mean something instead of being this sort of partisan scorekeeping or something like that. There's almost no common interest between the people at the Bethesda Country Club and the people in Allegheny County, Maryland. And so that's the sort of thing. So local governance, restoring local governments would be a big thing, but also having representation be something that means something would be significant.
Good, thank you. Questions from the audience? Yes, in the blue checkered shirt there.
Hey, Tim, thanks for coming.
Sure. Microphone coming.
Oh, of course. Tim, thanks for coming. You touched really briefly when you were talking about your anecdote about a working class guy in 1955, Pittsburgh area, that his wife could stay home if she wanted to. I think that the shift in women in the workplace in the past 50 whatever years is certainly a really interesting economic question, sort of doubling the supply of workers. I want to know, before we get a chance to dig into your book, is it an interesting question for you in your wheelhouse of community?
Oh, yeah.
And if it's not, feel free to say no and take another question.
Absolutely. I'm not the person to write a book about stay-at-home wives. I think one should be written, but not by a male, probably. But I will say this: when you talk about communities, you talk about the moms who would sit on the front porch and scold you if you were, being an idiot, and would be the ones to see the kid wipe out on the bike and take care of them. Having a person at home. Now, you could argue it could be a husband or whatever. A single income family has so many advantages for building community. And again, just for me, what I did with the T-ball last year in our parish was started like a cookout. So my wife staying at home was able to get all the food, and she would actually order it from the internet, but still be able to be there, organize it in the car so that when I got home from work, it was all there and laid out, and I could just go straight to the field and start grilling. And the people who were there earlier weren't even stay-at-home moms, but moms who had jobs that got off earlier and were more flexible. And here's a great irony. In the elite communities, married women are more likely to have part-time jobs than in the middle class and the working class.
Who have full-time.
Who are more likely to have full-time jobs. So women either staying at home or working part-time, it's sort of a U-curve. The poorest and the wealthiest. So you want to see one reason why the elites are doing well, more likely to have women with part-time or full-time jobs, plus the effects on wages and that sort of thing. And again, as with a lot of the problems I'm pointing to, we're not going to have legislative stuff here, but I would like to see legislation. There was one guy who wrote on Twitter the other day.
We had gotten all the way through without Twitter.
Twitter, yes. An argument for, he was saying, there are arguments for a daycare subsidy instead of paid leave or per child subsidy. And the argument for a daycare subsidy is that will get women into the workforce better and provide the employment for the daycare people rather than the economically inefficient thing of women leaving the workforce to, in an unpaid way, take care of their kids. So public policy maybe ought to favor paid labor over unpaid labor. So that's a mindset that exists and probably has guided some of our policy. So I would say at least abolish that framework in public policy.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is, how do you see the rise of technology and social media impacting all of the different sections of society?
Yep.
We were trying to avoid Twitter.
Yes. For one, Twitter allows me to see these really bad arguments. The same person on Twitter also was arguing that people should stop cooking for themselves and should just have Soylent for dinner. That's just, like it's a real thing. It's not just named after that. And otherwise order out because that's more economically efficient. I think social media in general to date has been a negative impact on community cohesion by just drawing people away from their physical environment. And if you have kids, nephews, nieces, neighbors, and you end up in an environment where it's like, you don't get to see your uncle that much and you're just going to be staring at your phone. I think that it's clear. The best thing about social media is using it to connect people so that they can then get together physically. And this is something I need to get better at, is making the case as to why being physically with people and then being present with them is good, because it seems so obvious to me and so many people I talk to, but sometimes people say, you have to argue why physical proximity is better than my virtual group. And it's a pretty big divide. I'm sure there are people who've written very good books and essays on this, but
about being a mammal, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. And Matt was actually somebody who was explaining to me, it was about chess. I was teaching my kids to play chess, and there's one point where we were passing an iPad back and forth to each other. He's like, if you play this in real chess, you'd be sitting across from your child, and there's lots of benefit to that. Right. But
I remember us bonding about having black and white screens on our phones.
Yes, setting our phones to be black and white so they were less addictive. So I do think that technology definitely changes the way we interact. I don't think it's inevitable that this will be negative in the long term. Humans are very adaptive. And while I was arguing that we don't see clearly always our need for connection, I think we sort of naturally build structures that connect us. And so it could be 20 years from now, I'll be writing about how all these technologies of the last 10 years have really connected us in a way that we were less connected in the past. But as it is now, as it's sort of a shock and a disturbance to the way humans interact, I think it is pushing us towards atomization.
Yes, please.
In front.
You're in the checkered dress.
So we live in America that about 25% of all the population is either immigrant or first generation American. So for a lot of those people, some of the institutions that you mentioned, like church or serving the community, other than your own family, or especially baseball, are kind of foreign and irrelevant. So how do you think some of the solutions that you mentioned are going to pan out in this new America that we have right now?
So I do talk about immigration in a couple different ways. For one, actually, Hispanic Catholics are more resilient in their church going regardless of their income. White Catholics who, if something happens and they make less money, they're more likely to stop going to church. And white Catholics who are poor are less likely to go. Among Hispanics, Hispanic Catholics, the church attendance is higher. And I imagine something is true like that for the evangelicals. So there are ways in which but then also the Muslim Americans, and this includes Muslim immigrant Americans, are more likely to say things like, with hard work, you can get ahead in America. They're more likely to say that than the average American is. And one of the stories I tell in the book is about a guy he was a Bangladeshi Muslim in Texas, working behind a counter at a 7-Eleven, and shortly after 9/11, a guy came in and shot him and his two colleagues, a hate crime revenge for September 11th. Two guys died, the one guy survived. And as he recovered, he started researching his victim. Why would this guy do this? And he researched where this working class white guy lived in Texas, and just was so despairing. His view, this immigrant from Bangladesh, his view of America was community and people coming together, and he had his Muslim community, and he saw other people, either really nice towns around Dallas or Christian community, and then he learned that a huge part of the people around him, native-born white working class, had this total alienation. And so the fact is, immigrants do better in America than native-born working-class whites. For a lot of people, and we stayed away from politics even longer than we stayed away from Twitter. For a lot of Trump's early base, that was evidence of some conspiracy by the elites against the regular guy. Oh, well, they're just giving gifts to the immigrants, and that's why they're doing better than us. No, it's because a lot of times, and often based around religion, the immigrant communities were more likely to just be tight-knit. And so this guy, who's this Bangladeshi immigrant, realized, I have the best of both worlds. I have a network of Muslim, Asian immigrant neighbors, but also sort of the opportunity of America and the pluralism of America where it can reach outside that. So on the immigrant question, I think that for me, I see it as sort of a beautiful aspect of the refreshing of the American dream that new people are coming in. But the dark side is, as Robert Putnam found, diversity and social cohesion don't often go together. And I tell the story in there of my next door neighbor, his name is Mr. Patel. And the way I get to know neighbors usually is I say, hey, I got this one neighbor, Tony. He's from Portugal. Tony, you want to come over for a beer? Tony comes over for a beer. We chat. He tells me about his job. He works up in the top of those really high cranes. That's awesome. We have a good chat. He goes to the same parish. I see him almost every week. And we borrow tools from each other. Mr. Patel, would you like to come over for a drink? He explains he doesn't drink alcohol because of his religion. He's a Hare Krishna. Mr. Patel, would you like to come over for coffee? No coffee. Mr. Patel, I got herbal tea. And he starts explaining to me why this violates his religion. I say, okay, I've got lime LaCroix. Putting your water in a can or a bottle like that is destructive of God's creation. And so, I hope you're not offended, Tim, but for religious purposes, I can't come over. So finally, I had to say to him, in like the most awkward way you could say it, Mr. Patel, the standard way I get to know a guy is by consuming a fluid with him. Which fluids do you actually consume? And he said, water with some lemon or lime in it. So I send Lucy and Charlie off to the store. They get a lemon and a lime. We fill up 2 pitchers, put the lime in one, the lemon in the other, cut into pieces, and get to know each other over gallons of gently citrified water. And we did it, but it was an immense hurdle because we didn't even have a language barrier. He speaks flawless English. but we just had a cultural barrier. And communities that have language barriers are going to have more obstacles to that. So that's my main concern about immigration is if you have a language barrier and you have a cultural barrier, it makes it much more laborious to build the social cohesion. And I think that's always been a problem in the US. And so you sometimes get people ghettoizing, but then those can become great stories. I mean, I know so many stories like, oh, well, Hell's Kitchen, and there's all these Irish kids, and it's Jimmy McInerney. I mean, it doesn't sound that different than our friend.
Right, our names.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. Yes, right there in the sports coat there.
Hi, thank you for coming out in the lovely weather. So when you're analyzing the exogenous shocks to something like Pittsburgh due to globalistic competition, how do you account for the difference between the good and the tragic outcomes of that? Like a low-income family that can now afford more nutritional food because a big business realizes economies of scale, vis-a-vis a kid that gets hooked on drugs, overdoses by his uncle, who is becoming unemployed and doesn't know what to do with his life. How do you account for that difference?
Yeah, I mean, how do you weigh them against one another? I thought about that some while writing the book, and I don't think I could do it. I mean, I can say the economy of the U.S. is better off because of immigration and because of free trade. And I can say there are places where the costs are immense and they're not merely economic, but they're literally deaths of despair. They're intergenerational just erosion of human capital, people not getting good education, people getting pregnant out of wedlock, having one kid who then does the same thing. And I don't know how to weigh them against one another. And to some extent, I don't think I have to, because it's not my decision to whether to make this happen or keep making this happen. We're not going to reverse it with the right tariffs or whatever, or the right subsidies for these factories. Because if you did that, you'd end up with robot factories and that sort of thing. But I do think one of the chapters in there, the subtitle is Progress at a Price. And this is a big thing. A lot of the work I do in here is trying to reach across to both right and left at the same time. And to say, yes, we've had immense progress since the 1950s. The fact that women can go to college and get good educations. More women are in grad school now. Not that I think grad school is necessarily a great idea, but more women are in grad school than men. Sorry, Dr. Mehan. And but that the progress, that again, it's not just me being able to get cheaper shoes for my kids. That just means they might have 2 pairs of shoes. It's a person who might not be able to buy shoes that fit their kids, being able to get them. That's one of the great benefits of China trade, right? So there are real benefits on both sides, and just that progress has come at a price. Since I don't believe the central planning will work, I don't know that I have to weigh them against each other. But I think it's key to articulate, just as we did with stay-at-home moms versus more working mothers, this social change, whatever progress it represents, it also has a huge cost, and we're not discussing the nature of our society well if we're not discussing both of them. So sorry, that's not a great satisfying answer, but so many of these things, the problem is people thinking, okay, a central plan can come up with just the right answer, but everything I'm talking about here, it's going to be a lot more complicated and a lot more organic if it's happening on 20,000 little platoons on a community level.
Well, Tim, I know when you talked about alienating or alienation, you said one of the key things is they cannot see the use of plugging back into community. Thank you very much for starting the vision.
Yep.
So thanks for coming.
Thank you.